I've called this homestead in Canton, Missouri home for 8 years now. My husband Jake and I came here with dreams of raising our 3 children away from city chaos, surrounded by goats, chickens, and the kind of peace you can only find on 60 acres of rolling farmland. Our red barn sits about 60 yards from the house, its weathered boards telling stories of decades past. And beyond it, our pasture slopes gently toward a dense tree line that marks our property's edge. The morning routine never changed. Goats bleating for their feed, chickens squabbling over scattered corn, and our kids bargaining for evening popsicles if they helped secure the henhouse. It was predictable, comfortable, safe. The space behind the barn, where thick grass grew toward those distant trees, was just background scenery, nothing more than a natural boundary that required no attention. That changed last June when my youngest daughter Emma, only 6 years old, made an observation that would shatter our family's sense of security forever. She was sitting at our kitchen table on a sweltering afternoon, purple popsicle juice staining her small wrist as she swung her legs from the chair. Without looking up from her melting treat, she announced with startling casualness, "Mom, there's a man in the hole behind the barn. He waved at me today." I paused in my dishwashing, soap suds dripping from my hands. "What hole, sweetheart?" "The big one past where the goats graze. He lives there." My first instinct was to laugh. Emma had been obsessed with digging elaborate forts in our backyard all summer, creating intricate tunnel systems she'd name and populate with imaginary residents. This seemed like more childhood fantasy, the kind of creative storytelling that makes parenting simultaneously delightful and exhausting. But something about her tone nagged at me. She hadn't said it with the excitement of make-believe or the uncertainty of imagination. She'd stated it as simple fact, the way she might mention seeing our neighbor's dog or a hawk circling overhead. That evening, as I completed my usual routine of securing the barn and checking on our animals, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Inside the main stall, pressed into the dusty wooden door, were small handprints at exactly Emma's height. The disturbing part? None of my children had been in that stall all day. I'd specifically told them to stay away while I treated an injured goat. I tried to dismiss it. Kids have a way of getting everywhere despite explicit instructions. But Emma's words echoed in my mind. The man in the hole behind the barn. Why so specific? Why the hole, as if referring to something established and permanent? Our blue tick hound Duke typically sleeps on the front porch, only rousing himself to bark at coyotes or the occasional delivery truck. He's a lazy dog by nature, conserving energy for genuine threats. For 3 consecutive nights after Emma's comment, Duke shattered the peaceful darkness with frantic barking, always facing the same direction, toward that back pasture behind the barn. Each night I'd stumble to the bedroom window and peer into darkness, seeing nothing but Duke straining against his chain, hackles raised, focused on something beyond my perception. The 3rd night, Jake joined me at the window. "What's wrong with that damn dog?" he muttered, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "He's been doing this every night since Emma mentioned..." I stopped myself. I hadn't told Jake about Emma's comment yet, partly because I'd been hoping it would prove meaningless. Jake grabbed his high-powered spotlight and stepped onto the porch, sweeping the beam across the pasture. Nothing appeared in the harsh white light except grass swaying in the night breeze and a few goats clustered near the fence. But Duke continued his agitated barking until Jake finally brought him inside, something we'd never done in 5 years of dog ownership. The next morning, I made a decision that would reveal horrors I never could have imagined. I was going to walk that back pasture in daylight and investigate whatever was triggering Duke's nightly alerts and capturing Emma's attention. The June heat was already oppressive by the time I finished morning chores. Armed with a walking stick and my phone, I headed past the barn toward the area that had become the focus of so much mysterious activity. The grass grew thick and high back there, dotted with wildflowers and buzzing with insects. I pushed through methodically, following the natural slope of the land toward the tree line. About 40 yards behind the barn, where the pasture began its gentle rise, I discovered something that made my heart stop completely. Concealed beneath a carefully arranged camouflage of cut branches, dried grass, and natural debris was a hand-excavated pit, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet deep. This wasn't some natural depression or forgotten root cellar. Someone had dug this with deliberate precision. My hands trembled as I pulled away the concealing brush, revealing the full scope of what lay hidden beneath. The pit contained everything needed for extended human habitation. Military-style blankets arranged as bedding, empty cans of beans and soup, a plastic water jug, a small pile of AA batteries, and most chillingly, a digital camera mounted on a cheap tripod positioned at the pit's edge. The camera was aimed with perfect precision toward the back of our house, providing a clear view of our kitchen windows, back porch, and the children's swing set where Emma and her siblings played every day. The red recording light wasn't blinking, and when I checked, the SD card slot was empty, but the implications were horrifyingly clear. Someone had been living in this carefully concealed pit, watching our family, potentially recording our daily activities, learning our routines with the patience of a predator studying prey. I stood there unable to move or breathe properly, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't random trespassing or temporary shelter seeking. This was systematic, organized surveillance, with our family, specifically our children, as the target. With shaking hands, I called the county sheriff's office. 2 deputies arrived within an hour, carefully photographing and documenting every aspect of the pit and its contents. They collected the blankets, empty food containers, and camera equipment as evidence, asking detailed questions about any suspicious activity we'd noticed. "Ma'am, have you seen any strangers on your property recently?" Deputy Martinez asked while photographing the surveillance setup. "Any vehicles that didn't belong? People asking unusual questions?" I told them about Emma's comment about the man in the hole and Duke's 3 nights of agitated barking. The deputies took notes, but seemed to view this as relatively routine. "Probably someone passing through who found a convenient place to set up temporary camp," Deputy Johnson suggested. "The camera's concerning, but without the SD card, we can't determine what, if anything, was actually recorded." Their casual attitude frustrated me deeply. This clearly represented something far more sinister than temporary trespassing. The careful construction of the pit, the strategic positioning of surveillance equipment, the evidence of extended habitation, this suggested someone who had invested significant time and effort into watching our family. That night, neither Jake nor I could sleep. We took turns maintaining watch from our living room, lights off, scanning for any sign of movement around the property. Around 11:30 p.m., headlights appeared on our usually deserted road, slowing as they passed our driveway before continuing into the darkness. The timing felt too coincidental. In 8 years of living here, vehicles never cruised our isolated road at that hour unless they were lost or had specific business with neighboring farms. I called my brother Tom, who lives a mile away. He arrived quickly, and together we established surveillance from our darkened living room, phones ready to document any suspicious activity. At 1:40 a.m., our vigilance was rewarded. Duke began his familiar frantic barking, but this time we were watching and ready. Through our back window, I caught clear sight of movement near the barn. a human figure moving with deliberate stealth along the building's side, pausing near the area where we'd discovered the pit. Duke strained against his chain with such violence I worried he might break free, barking with an intensity that seemed to echo across the entire countryside. The figure didn't flee immediately like a typical surprise trespasser. Instead, it moved carefully in a low crouch, appearing to retrieve something from the concealed pit area. Without thinking, I shouted through the window, "We see you! Get away from here!" That broke the spell. The figure bolted toward the tree line with surprising speed, disappearing into the darkness beyond our property boundaries. Duke continued his aggressive alerts until his voice grew hoarse, pulling against his restraint as if trying to pursue the fleeing intruder. When dawn finally arrived, Tom and I've been farming the same Iowa soil for 23 years, land that my father worked before me and his father before him. At 42, my life in October 2019 revolved around the predictable rhythms of grain farming, monitoring moisture levels, maintaining equipment, and the endless cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting that defines agricultural life in the heartland. Our operation centers on 3 concrete grain silos that rise like monuments from our modest farmstead, visible for miles across the flat Iowa landscape. 2 remain in active use during harvest season, but the third, positioned on the north side of our property, had been mothballed since 2014 when we upgraded our storage capacity. I kept it mainly for spare parts and occasional overflow, but mostly it stood empty, a 40-foot concrete cylinder that had outlived its usefulness. The silo measured roughly 20 feet in diameter, with walls thick enough to withstand the pressure of thousands of bushels of grain. Inside, the space was cavernous and circular, with a conical floor designed to funnel grain toward the central auger system. A steel ladder ran up the exterior wall to the top access hatch, while a heavy metal door at ground level provided entry for cleaning and maintenance. I'd secured that door with a standard padlock years ago, more from habit than any real security concerns. October means harvest season in Iowa, and that year I was running hard 16-hour days trying to bring in the corn crop before weather could damage it. My routine was exhausting but familiar. Pre-dawn equipment checks, long days in the combine, evenings spent moving grain and planning the next day's work. By nightfall, I was typically too tired for anything except a quick supper and immediate collapse into bed. It was during one of those exhausted evenings, while drinking water at my kitchen sink to wash harvest dust from my throat, that I first noticed something that made my blood run cold. The kitchen window faces north toward the unused silo, providing a clear view across about 100 yards of farmyard. As I stood there letting cool water ease the day's accumulated grit from my mouth, I caught sight of a faint glow emanating from inside the supposedly empty silo. The light appeared just above the base level, soft and inconsistent, like illumination from a cell phone screen cupped in someone's hands to hide its brightness. The glow would appear for several seconds, disappear completely, then reappear in a slightly different position within the circular structure, as if someone was moving slowly around the silo's interior perimeter. I set down my glass and stared more intently, wondering if harvest exhaustion was causing hallucinations. But the light was definitely there, creating a pattern of movement that suggested deliberate human activity inside a structure that should have been completely empty and securely locked. I grabbed my high-powered spotlight from the mudroom and headed outside into the crisp October night. The air was clear and cold, with enough starlight to navigate safely across the farmyard. I approached the silo cautiously, listening for any sounds that might explain the mysterious illumination I'd observed. When I reached the structure and swept my spotlight beam across its exterior, everything appeared normal. The padlock hung exactly where I'd left it, showing no signs of tampering or forced entry. I unlocked the door and directed my light into the interior, playing the beam across the empty concrete surfaces. Nothing seemed out of place initially, just bare walls and the dusty residue of grain storage from years past. But as I examined the floor more carefully, I discovered something that made my skin crawl. A single set of boot prints pressed into the accumulated dust, forming a circular pattern around the silo's interior perimeter. The prints were too deliberate to be accidental, too purposeful to result from casual exploration. Someone had been inside this locked structure, walking methodical circles in the darkness for unknown reasons. I secured the door carefully when I left, but unease settled deep in my chest. Someone had trespassed on my property, gained access to my buildings, and conducted mysterious activities in what should have been a completely secure space. The next evening, at almost exactly the same time, the phenomenon repeated itself. Same kitchen window, same viewing angle, same ghostly light moving in slow patterns inside the silo walls. This time, I knew it wasn't fatigue or optical illusion. Someone was systematically using my property for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. I decided to investigate the exterior ladder that provided access to the silo's top hatch. Running my spotlight up its length, I discovered that while most of the metal rungs were covered with dust and spider webs indicating long disuse, the lower portion showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Finger marks in the accumulated grime suggested someone had been using this ladder regularly, steadying themselves as they climbed. Inside the silo, the circular boot print patterns had become more elaborate. What had been simple perimeter walking now showed concentric circles, figure-8 patterns, and complex geometric shapes pressed into the dust, as if someone was using the space for increasingly sophisticated activities. On the third night, I positioned a motion-activated trail camera on the grain auger housing, aimed directly at the silo's entrance. If someone was accessing this structure, I was going to capture photographic evidence of their activities. At 2:17, my phone chimed with a motion detection alert from the camera, but when I checked the recorded footage, I found only corrupted digital files, nothing but static and fragmented images that provided no useful information. In 15 years of using trail cameras to monitor deer patterns and equipment security, I'd never experienced such a complete technical failure. The following night brought the same mysterious glow from inside the silo. This time, I approached with the patience and stealth of someone hunting extremely cautious prey, moving slowly and quietly across the farmyard. The padlock remained secure, but inside, I discovered that the dust patterns had evolved into something almost artistic, elaborate spirals and interconnected circles that suggested hours of careful, deliberate walking. On the third night, I positioned a motion-activated trail camera on the grain auger housing, aimed directly at the silo's entrance. If someone was accessing this structure, I was going to capture photographic evidence of their activities. At 2:17, my phone chimed with a motion detection alert from the camera, but when I checked the recorded footage, I found only corrupted digital files, nothing but static and fragmented images that provided no useful information. In 15 years of using trail cameras to monitor deer patterns and equipment security, I'd never experienced such a complete technical failure. The following night brought the same mysterious glow from inside the silo. This time, I approached with the patience and stealth of someone hunting extremely cautious prey, moving slowly and quietly across the farmyard. The padlock remained secure, but inside, I discovered that the dust pattern had evolved into something almost artistic, elaborate spirals and interconnected circles that suggested hours of careful, deliberate walking. On the third night, I positioned a motion-activated trail camera on the grain auger housing, aimed directly at the silo's entrance. If someone was accessing this structure, I was going to capture photographic evidence of their activities. At 2:17, my phone chimed with a motion detection alert from the camera, but when I checked the recorded footage, I found only corrupted digital files, nothing but static and fragmented images that provided no useful information. In 15 years of using trail cameras to monitor deer patterns and equipment security, I'd never experienced such a complete technical failure. The following night brought the same mysterious glow from inside the silo. This time, I approached with the patience and stealth of someone hunting extremely cautious prey, moving slowly and quietly across the farmyard. The padlock remained secure, but inside, I discovered that the dust patterns had evolved into something almost artistic, elaborate spirals and interconnected circles that suggested hours of careful, deliberate walking. On the third night, I positioned a motion-activated trail camera on the grain auger housing, aimed directly at the silo's entrance. If someone was accessing this structure, I was going to capture photographic evidence of their activities. At 2:17, my phone chimed with a motion detection alert from the camera, but when I checked the recorded footage, I found only corrupted digital files, nothing but static and fragmented images, 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 nothing but static and fragmented images. Running 640 acres of Oklahoma wheat as a single mother isn't the life I planned, but it's the reality I've built for myself and my 11-year-old son Jacob. When my father passed 5 years ago, I couldn't bear the thought of letting 3 generations of family land go to strangers or developers. So here we are, living like a small island in an endless ocean of golden grain that stretches from our modest farmhouse to every horizon. The isolation used to bring me peace. There's something profoundly beautiful about wheat fields that extend so far they seem to touch the sky, creating ever-changing patterns as wind moves through the stalks. Our house sits surrounded by this agricultural vastness, connected to civilization by a gravel road that might see 3 vehicles on a busy day. Jacob loves exploring these fields during daylight hours, creating tunnels and paths through the tall stalks, pretending he's navigating a vast natural maze. I encourage his outdoor adventures because I want him to develop the same deep connection to this land that shaped my own childhood. Our daily routine follows predictable agricultural rhythms. Mornings begin with equipment checks and field assessments. Afternoons involve whatever maintenance or seasonal work needs attention, and evenings are reserved for homework, dinner, and the simple pleasure of watching sunset paint our wheat fields in brilliant shades of gold and amber. It was during one of those peaceful evening routines in late July that Jacob made a comment that would fundamentally change how I viewed our beautiful, isolated surroundings forever. The day had been brutally hot, one of those sticky Oklahoma summers where even the wind feels exhausted. I'd spent the afternoon checking irrigation systems and monitoring grain moisture levels, routine tasks that had become second nature during my years of managing the farm alone. Jacob was at our kitchen table when I came inside, pencil in hand, working through summer math worksheets without his usual complaints. I rewarded his cooperation with a popsicle, one of those small gestures that help maintain peace when you're balancing single motherhood with the constant demands of agricultural life. These simple rhythms and predictable rewards are what keep our life manageable. Jacob looked up from his papers and made a comment so quiet I almost missed it. "Mom, The men are back. I was at the sink, washing the day's dust and sweat from my hands and face when his words registered fully. "What men, sweetheart?" He pointed casually toward our kitchen window that faced the largest expanse of wheat field. I squinted through the glass, but all I could see was the familiar sight of shoulder-high grain swaying gently in the evening breeze, creating those hypnotic wave patterns that had soothed me since childhood. "Honey, there's nobody out there, just the wheat moving with the wind." Jacob didn't argue or insist, which struck me as unusual since he typically defended his observations when he felt strongly about something. He simply hunched back over his notebook and continued working. But something about his tone, that matter-of-fact whisper, embedded itself in my consciousness and refused to fade. The next evening, I found myself standing at that same kitchen window, washing dishes while watching light gradually drain from the sky across our fields. That's when I saw them. Two shapes standing among the wheat stalks, distinctly taller and more rigid than the grain surrounding them. At first glance, I thought they might be fence posts or pieces of equipment I'd somehow forgotten about. But I knew every inch of our property intimately, and there were no posts or structures in that location. I blinked and leaned closer to the window, trying to focus more clearly on whatever I was seeing. In the brief moment I looked away and back, the shapes had vanished completely. Nothing remained but endless wheat moving naturally in the breeze, no trace of whatever had captured my attention. I attempted to rationalize the experience. Wheat fields are notorious for creating optical illusions, especially when late afternoon sun sits low on the horizon and shadows stretch long across the landscape. The repetitive vertical pattern of thousands of grain stalks can generate false shapes that appear and disappear depending on viewing angle, lighting conditions, and observer fatigue. I didn't mention the incident to Jacob. If it was merely imagination or visual tricks, there was no point in creating unnecessary anxiety. If it represented something real, I needed to understand what we might be dealing with before involving my son in potentially dangerous situations. A few nights later, I was folding laundry on our living room couch while Jacob slept peacefully in his bedroom down the hall. The house was quiet, except for familiar rural night sounds, cricket choruses, distant cattle lowing from neighboring farms, and the constant whisper of wind moving through wheat stalks. That's when I heard something that clearly didn't belong. Low murmurs carried on the night breeze through our open windows. Not just one voice, but two distinct speakers engaged in what sounded like quiet conversation. The rhythm and cadence suggested back and forth dialogue, though I couldn't distinguish individual words or phrases. I stepped onto our front porch, straining to locate the source of these mysterious voices. The moment I appeared outside, the murmuring stopped instantly, as if whoever was speaking had detected my presence and immediately fallen silent. I stood perfectly motionless, holding my breath and focusing every bit of attention on listening for any continuation of the sounds. For several long minutes, the night remained quiet except for natural ambient noise. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself I'd imagined the entire episode, I heard distinct rustling from our wheat field, not the usual gentle swish of wind-blown grain, but the deliberate sound of something large moving purposefully through the dense stalks. The rustling had an unmistakably intentional quality, like someone carefully pushing through the grain while trying to minimize noise. It moved in a roughly parallel line to our property's edge, maintaining distance from the house, but clearly audible in the still night air. I remained on the porch until the sound faded completely into the distance, then waited another 20 minutes before going back inside. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I found myself straining to hear any repetition of the voices or movement, but the remaining hours passed without incident. The following morning, I walked along the edge of our wheat field where I'd heard the suspicious rustling. The grain grew so thick and tall that finding evidence of passage was nearly impossible under normal circumstances. But about 50 yards from our house, I discovered something that confirmed my growing fears. A crumpled candy wrapper pressed into the dirt at the field's border. The wrapper was for a brand I'd never purchased, definitely not something that could have blown from our property or been dropped by Jacob during his outdoor play. Someone had been there, close enough to our house to discard trash, recently enough that weather hadn't yet degraded the brightly colored packaging. The breaking point came exactly 1 week later. I'd gone to bed around 11 o'clock, exhausted from a demanding day of equipment maintenance and crop monitoring. At 1:20 a.m., our motion sensor porch light suddenly blazed to light, flooding our front yard with harsh white illumination that immediately woke me from deep sleep. My heart hammered against my ribs as I grabbed a flashlight from my bedside table and approached the front door with extreme caution. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to project confidence while my hands trembled with adrenaline and fear. For a moment, the night remained perfectly still and silent. Then, just beyond the circle of harsh light cast by our porch fixture, I saw them clearly. 2 dark human shapes moving among the weed stalks in a way that seemed fundamentally unnatural. They were definitely human figures, but they moved with coordination that suggested practiced collaboration. Rather than walking upright through the grain, they lowered themselves beneath the height of the wheat stalks and glided sideways through the field like swimmers navigating underwater, their movements too smooth and synchronized to be casual trespassers or lost travelers. I immediately locked the door and dialed 911 with shaking hands. Within 20 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived with high-powered flashlights and, more importantly, a thermal imaging device capable of detecting body heat through dense vegetation. "There," Deputy Morrison muttered, pointing at his thermal screen. 2 heat signatures moving through the grain field. The device showed faint, warm blobs shifting and fading through the wheat, but the images were frustratingly indistinct, just vague heat patterns that disappeared before the deputies could reach their locations. In the wheat field, they discovered fresh evidence that confirmed we were dealing with real intruders rather than imagination or natural phenomenon. Multiple sets of boot prints in different sizes, indicating at least 2 people had been moving through our grain. The tracks ran parallel to our property line, following the tree line that bordered our fields, before ending abruptly in an area where weed stalks had been flattened in an irregular pattern. "Looks like they just vanished into thin air," Deputy Harrison observed, studying the compressed grain where the footprints terminated with no continuation in any direction. The